We are going to continue talking about these theoretical approaches to object recognition in the second part here of perceiving objects and scenes. So another approach to object perception comes from Gestalt psychology. And this was a field of psychology, a kind of psychology that came around in the early 1900s. They were somewhat a response to, if you remember your psychology history, that we had the functionalists and the structuralists as two of our big schools of psychology, and that the structuralists believed, and there were a great many of them, they were a pretty powerful field back in the late 1800s when psychology started and into the early 1900s, that they believed that we could describe our worlds, and so how our mind is experiencing the world, by giving people discrete sensations and having them describe as objectively as possible those discrete sensations. Okay, so Gestalt psychology, the word Gestalt actually stands for the word, it's German for something like shape or whole. I think it can be either one of those words. And so this came from some German psychologists. One is Max Wertheimer, and in 1911 he came up with some questions because he bought a toy stroboscope. And I'm going to tell you what this is. We see things like this all the time now, but back before television, one of the ways there were some interesting ways that we are actually going to talk about throughout this class of how they entertain themselves. But one of the ways they entertain themselves was to have these little stroboscopes, and we still have them. We don't have them like we used to because we have television and movies and all kinds of moving pictures. But the stroboscope would be like when you create a flip book. I don't know if you've created one of these flip books where if a person is standing in a particular stance, and then and then the next picture of the person, maybe it's a stick figure or whatever, moves just slightly, and the next one moves just slightly, and the next one moves just slightly, and then you flip the pages, it looks like there's actual movement, right? Because of the timing of those close approximations, but with these slightly different stances, it looks like the person is actually moving. Well, with stroboscopes, they did this with these round like things where you could look through, and there'd be a little slot that would stop your vision for a second, and the pictures, the moving pictures, would be spinning around in this stroboscope. So it shows a kind of illusion of movement that when we talk about motion perception, we'll talk about apparent motion, or this particular kind of illusion of movement. I have another example over to your right, which is if we have one light flash and then we have darkness and then a second light flashes, if we have the correct amount of time, if the timing is correct there, what people experience is what happens in D. A flash, and then that flash of light moves to where the second flash of light is. But that's not what's actually happening, right? What happened was flash, darkness, flash, but we experience it as movement. And so Max Wertheimer's question with the stroboscope was, how is this illusion of movement caused if all I can use to describe my experience are these discrete sensations? And I don't have this as a green question, even though it's a good thing to think about. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you that it really can't. We can't describe our experience in a set of discrete sensations because our experience is more holistic. It involves us moving through time and things happening through time, and that's how we just experience the world. It's just how it is. So the overall kind of notion of Gestalt psychology is the whole is different than the sum of the parts. Okay, and they have this emphasis on perceptual organization, that we're doing this kind of more holistic organization of our scene in order to figure out what objects are. And the picture at the top there is just a nice example of how the whole is different than the sum of its parts, that bicycle is the whole. But if you just look at the parts over on the left-hand side, they're kind of meaningless and they don't make up a bicycle like that. It's just a bunch of pieces and parts. And I have another example here. And again, this is usually one of those, this is usually a very interactive, and I tell you, and I ask you what you see in A and in B and in C. So go ahead and think through, what do I see in A? What do I see in B? What do I see in C? For A, I usually get this kind of maybe a couple of Pac-Men. Because B is right under it and it's part of it, I've tried to do this where it's more layered, but this is the way my picture comes out. Because B is under it, you might start to see A as part of a triangle, but you can see it as Pac-Man. B, we really see the white triangle, right? And if I tell you to really imagine that those are three Pac-Men looking at each other or whatever, you can say, okay. But that triangle, right, this sense of closure that we have, that triangle is not even there at all. I'm sure that's not a surprise. I'm sure you've had this in Psych 101, but you are filling in those lines of the triangle that are between the Pac-Men. They don't exist. So there's no triangle. It's just three Pac-Men. But we perceive this kind of really holistic. We're putting it all together, and it looks like there's a triangle on top of some circles. And so we even can see kind of the lines of the triangle that don't exist between the circles. And we can make it an even stronger illusion if we put these little arms and legs out coming from the triangle. And so the Gestalt psychologists came up with a number of principles of perceptual organization, and I have some listed here of simplicity, sometimes called pragnance, some similarity, proximity, common region, good continuation, synchrony, common fate, and meaningfulness or familiarity. And my plan is to get through these, even though, again, I usually do this with people, and this is a lot funner when you all are describing. It's kind of weird, actually, to be doing it on my own. I don't love it. But we're going to go through each one of these with some examples. So simplicity, or pragnance, if I try to say that more German-like. If I ask you to describe that picture on the left, I have gotten many different descriptions of this picture. Some of them take me a while to see. For me, if most of us would say it's a square and a triangle and a circle kind of overlapping, and I'm going to go ahead and go to this one. That is kind of the point, that we put it into these simplistic shapes, but some of us probably got a little bit more creative, and I'm actually going to move to and come back to later familiarity or meaningfulness. We probably made it into something meaningful. So I kind of sometimes see it as a little face or a little head with a hat on it. I have heard students call it a Christmas tree with the what goes around the Christmas tree. I can't think of what that is. That little cloth that goes under the Christmas tree. I have had students call it a rocket, which always takes me a while to see. I've had other answers where it is a more holistic, we don't pull it into the simplistic parts, but we are making it into something meaningful. But most of us, a lot of people usually say, well, it looks like a square and a triangle and a circle overlapping with each other, and those are really the most simple shapes, and we see them as overlapping because of this organization of that we use simplicity as a way to organize our perceptual world. And here's one that almost always works, simplicity or pragnance. If I ask you to describe in A, some people say rings, some people say the Olympic rings, some people say circles, but nobody, okay, I've never had anybody say, and even with B up there underneath it, nobody says, well, it's these, what is that, it's these 9 weird shapes. Some of them are large, some of them are small, some of them are partial circles, some of them are these weird kind of eyeball-looking things, and some of them have, so nobody says that, okay? We all say it's rings of some kind in this the more simple design and the more simple interpretation of each of those constituents. Similarity is the second one. So if I ask you what you see on the left, a lot of people say they see the 86. Okay, and that 86 is the more reddish looking color on a more like greenish, darkish background. And we're separating out the reddish color. What's similar are those dots that are red, and we're making it into an 86, and we're separating that out from the greenish, darkish background. We're putting that all together into the background, the greenish looking dots. If you have a color deficiency, it doesn't look like anything to you, and we will talk about this is it's not an Ishihara plate, but it's another kind of test for color deficiency. If I ask you on the right to describe that, most people see columns of circles and columns of squares. So again, we're putting together the things that are similar to each other, and if those had been all circles, we might not know if they're rows or columns or if it's just a whole square. It's not as clear how to organize the information, but with the differences, with the similarity of the circles, we want to put those together, and with the similarity of the squares, we want to put those together, and we want to separate out the circles from the squares. Here's a picture from an old version of the textbook that I just always liked. We tend to put Tiger Woods, he's the one I recognize, I don't know the other guy, with this other golfer, and we tend to really perceptually group them together, right? Because they have so much in common. They're looking in the same direction, they're both wearing baseball hats, they're both holding their golf clubs in a similar way and their arms in a similar way, even their left leg is moving forward. I mean, we so put those together as because of the similarity of the two people. Proximity or nearness is the next one. So if I ask people to describe the figure on the left, here is where we see, like I did with similarity, that if they were all circles, it gets a little harder, right? And well, it's not that it's harder, but that some of us, it's more ambiguous. Some of us describe it as a square made of circles. Some of us describe it with the rows. It can kind of change and morph because everything is of equal nearness. Now, if we look at the one on the right, and I ask you to describe it, that's a little different, right? Because the circles that are in columns are close to each other, but there's distance between them. We perceive this. I don't know how to. There's distance between them horizontally, that we perceive this as columns of circles, and it's actually a little bit difficult to try to perceive it as rows of circles, or you can still kind of see a square of circles, but it's what we tend to see as a column of circles because of again, the proximity within the column and then the distance between the columns. I really like to use this example still. I stole this from Dr. Robin Morris, who has retired. But if I ask you, so I can't really do it without my laser pointer very easily, but if you look down to the right, oh, I cannot do it at all without my laser pointer. If you look down to the right and there's this little, like, it looks like a Wi-Fi signal or a skirt. I don't know what it looks like. It's a circle with some lines down sort of towards the right. I ask you, does it belong with the figure on the right or the figure on the left? And everybody agrees. I don't know what it is, but it belongs to the figure on the right. I can't do I just can't do it without my laser pointer. Okay. But so my other point is usually that thing that's coming, so the figure on the left, there's this thing coming out of his face that we kind of, I kind of assume it's part of the costume coming out from behind his face. But again, what is that? Where the figure on the right's almost touching it with his hand, right? What is that? We don't know. But who does it belong to? It belongs with the figure on the left because it's closer to the figure on the left, and so that's how we organize the information with what's near, even though again I don't know what that is. It could be a little alien, I don't know. And another example of proximity or nearness. And I know it feels like I'm hitting this one, the nail over the head, over and over, but this actually brings me to the next example, which I like juxtaposing them against each other. So on the top, we tend to see those two circles and then another two circles next to each other, and the space in between, we tend to separate those groups of circles from each other. In the bottom picture, in A, it kind of looks like they're all together. In B, again, we see these pairs, right? Because the two that are close to each other, we're going to organize those as being together, and then there's a separation or a space. So the next two that are close to each other, we separate them from the first two and put them together. This is so much easier with people in my classroom and with a laser pointer. And C, of course, we interpret it differently, right? And it's all about proximity. And why I left that last one in, even though I like my first two examples kind of more, is because if we look at common region, well, now we're looking at those same circles, right, that were close to each other, and we grouped them together, but all we have to do is we can change that around quite a bit by changing the region. And so the common region kind of trumps, right, proximity, because those two circles that are farther away, because they appear to be in the common region, we're going to group those together. And then the next two circles are farther away, where the one in this middle figure, the one on the left, is closer to the circle right next to it, but we don't group it there, right? We group it within its common region. And the figure on the bottom, I can't remember what he has in the book anymore, or where I got these, but it also shows that we can create this common region in different ways. And so this is one example where one of their principles of perceptual organization, they're usually called the Gestalt laws. They're not really laws, right? They're really heuristics for us to interpret the world. But one of these principles or heuristics can trump another one of the principles or heuristics. And these are pretty strongly, I think we all agree, but we're going to see some examples where where people don't agree. Good continuation is another Gestalt principle of perceptual organization. I'm going to start with the picture on the bottom because it's easier to talk about, and then I'll think about how to do the one on the top. If I ask you between A, B, C, and D, what is A connected to? Most people say B, right? And most people, it's actually kind of difficult to see. If I tell you, well, no, it's A is connected to C, you're going to tell me, I don't know about that. Or A is connected to D. Well, why not? Well, because this kind of smooth and flowing, we see things as continuing, and if they're smooth and flowing, we want to see it that way. We don't want to see so much these jerky, jagged lines. So we naturally see A as connected to B and C as connected to D because it gives us this kind of good continuation. The one on the top is more difficult to talk about, again, without my laser pointer, but if you look at what appears to be kind of a black line, right, this smoothly rolling up and down this kind of hill black line, I'm going to again tell you that black line doesn't exist. We have black figures and white figures, and they have these kind of jerky, jagged relationships with each other, but they also meet up at just the right spot where we can perceive this smoothly flowing line that has good continuation. We actually see this all of the time, and again, not sure where I got this. I don't think it's in the textbook. It might have been in an old version, but I really like this because it shows how when you're reading research even, we're going to make our figures look like the one on the right. I don't like that he switched around the different people's names with their actual data, but the one on the right, that's the way we would see this in if you go and look at any research, they're going to have this from the smallest to the largest, right? Because that's sort of, it's easier to process for us if it has this kind of good continuation. Whereas if we start with the one if we have the one on the left where Mike had a few, Jill had a lot, Alan had very little, Lisa had a lot, but not as much as Jill. That kind of jerky, jagged way of talking about something and about showing data, even that's really, it's just harder to process. Another Gestalt principle of perceptual organization is synchrony. And I have left this in, although he took it out of the book, because we're going to come back to these Gestalt principles when we talk about hearing. And synchrony is particularly important, I think, for hearing, but for vision too. So what this is trying to show is that the lights where it looks like a sunlight, those are the lights coming on. The lights where it's a little blue ball, those are the lights that are off. And if those sunlight bulbs are all coming on at the same time and the other ones are off, and then the sunlight bulbs all go off and the ones that are little blue circles come on, if that's happening in synchrony, again, it doesn't really matter about proximity. I mean, it just doesn't have as strong an influence on our perceptual organization as this kind of synchrony in time. Another Gestalt principle of perceptual organization is common fate. And this is another one that really kind of happens through time. And I think the picture on your left is from your textbook. So you can kind of think back to those times when you've seen this flock of birds and they're all flying together. And then as soon as some small subset flies off in a different direction, they separate, right, into two separate flocks of birds. So as long as they have a common fate, we really organize them as being together. I have a picture again from Robin Morris that I think the idea was that all of these dancers who are moving to our right, that we would perceptually organize them together because they have this common fate, and the ones that are moving to the left that are kind of behind there, that they're going to be organized separately because they're moving to the left. But this is one of those examples, and you can see, I find this really fascinating that not only do some of these principles trump the other ones, but we don't all use the same principles. So for me, I don't know what you perceived as going together, but for me, the guy in the front he is perceptually segregated, and then the two in the back, and then the two at the other side, the two on the left and the two on the right. That is really this kind of proximity for me. But some people talk about the guys in the orange as all being a clump and the guy in the front being different, and that would be similarity. So in that case, we might all be using different principles of perceptual organization for organizing that scene. And some of this probably has to do with how strongly we are influenced by that kind of implied motion in the scene. And if we were actually watching the motion, that common fate would probably be much, much stronger. When I think of common fate, I usually think of that human traffic circle there on Gibbs Green. That's like you go across the Pickens Street Bridge, and there's this like human traffic circle that right now is kind of empty. But usually when I teach this class, there are these times when it's so full and you feel like part of the group. You're part of the whole thing. But then people go off on one of those trails. I go off to Barnwell, to the psychology building, and I separate, right? While I'm in this traffic circle, I'm part of the group, and I'm even organizing myself as part of that group. But then when I veer off, I have a different fate, and I'm no longer grouped with those people. And I'm going to end with familiarity or meaningfulness. I have done something kind of wonky with my slides, so I'm not exactly sure how much time I have left, but usually we sit and students tell me what they see. You could look at this for a long time. I could look at this for a long time. And I'm just going to, so whatever faces or animals you're seeing, usually it's the animals that we're seeing, it's partly because of the faces. And I skipped some of this. I think this was in the earlier chapters of how we really have a strong preference for faces. We have this preference even as infants. And so what is probably most familiar to us and most meaningful are faces. And if you've ever, so my house is mostly wood, and those dark splotches in the wood, we'll even interpret those as eyes, nose, and mouth if we possibly can. And the last one, this is as far as we're getting. The familiarity, you can also, some people have to turn this off. They say this is very disturbing, but most people just find it fun that while we have this scene, again, those faces pop out as they are very meaningful and familiar to us. Anything that we can put together, an eyes, a nose, and a mouth. We prefer that, and we have lots of experience with that. Okay, and I am out of time. I'm going to put these green questions up. Think about them. And sometimes we have really great conversations, and sometimes we end up moving on because I'm behind at this point. But think about the issues and questions in relation to how we are perceiving objects. And then think about what's lacking in these proposed theoretical approaches. I mean, we've really only talked about recognition by components theory and the Gestalt principles of perceptual organization as far as answering all those questions of all those challenges to object recognition.